So hello everyone and welcome to the Fourth World Small-Scale Fisheries Congress in Latin America and the Caribbean. My name is Nova Almine. So I will be your Zoom host as well as your chair for this virtual session. We have 6 speakers and each speaker will have 15 minutes time. Please note that this session will automatically end on time. And for questions, you can please put it in the Q&A box so we can read it and will be answered by the speakers. Okay, so I think now we're ready to start. Our first speaker is Maria Cruz-Torres. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. And really want to thank everybody who's joining us to this afternoon for this panel. I'm very happy and to be able to present my work. My name is Maria L. Cruz-Torres. I am an anthropologist and an associate professor at Arizona State University in the School of Transborder Studies. I've been working in Mexico for over 25 years. So the research that I'm presenting today about women, food security, and small-scale fisheries in Mexico is part of a longer project, which is actually a book that I'm just completing almost there. It's about my research, and it's about trying to understand the role of women within Mexican fisheries and their contribution to food security. So these are basically my research goal, but I think the goal that I'm going to be examining today, because this is a very long project, is basically to examine the ways in which women utilize fishing resources for food and for a livelihood. I think this is going to be the main question that I'm going to be addressing, but then I have other goals for the overall research project as well. So this is the area where I'm doing research, and I have been conducting research again here over 20, for this project specifically, about 15 years. So it is my research sites are located in the southern region of Sinaloa, Mexico, which is a state located on the northwestern Mexico. You can see here some of the areas that I'm doing research, but most of my research and the one that I'm going to be discussing today actually takes place more in Mazatlan City, which is a city, also one of the main cities in northwestern Mexico, which is a little bit north of El Gualamo and also north of these other municipalities here. It doesn't really show much on the map, but it is a little bit up here in that area. So in terms of the methodology, again, a lot of my research, because I am an anthropologist, I do a lot of what is called participant observation, meaning that I'm there, I spend a lot of time living with people, sharing with them, interacting with them throughout many seasons of many years. But also I conduct the household surveys, especially because there was not really a lot of information about women's participation in the fisheries in Mexico. I conducted also around 84 oral interviews with shrimp traders, labor unions, alumni from the University of Sinaloa, municipal government employees, and also shrimp sellers, just to understand the place of women and the history of women's participation in Mexican fisheries. I also did archival research to kind of find documentation about that participation, historical documentation in newspapers and government reports as well. I also use photography as a way of also communicating or interacting more, having more like that kind of participatory research with many of the women that are part of this project. Well, so my theory and the main theoretical framework that really guides my research is feminist political ecology, which is a very, I would say, very, it allows for a lot of flexibility in the sense that it means interpretation is basically to allow us to study the relationship between gender and how gender shapes access and exclusion to important natural resources. It was very important for me to really develop this theory, and I have a lot, like a whole kind of a whole chapter about this theory. But I think it also gave me the means through which to understand how natural resources and how women's participation, for example, in Mexican fisheries is something that is because it's gender, it's also being a little bit invisible at the same time. And the idea of fishing political ecology is to really acknowledge their contribution and to understand how they claim their own space and their own access to natural resources within a very, very traditionally male-dominated industry. So there has been a lot of research really done about the relationship between small-scale fisheries and food security, and I think this is very obvious in many places in the global South. In Mexico, there's still a very few research really addressing this kind of connection, but based on this report that was published by the Food and Drug Administration of the United Nations, I think Food and Agriculture Organization, of the United Nations, there are two means in which women actually, and small-scale fisheries in general, kind of contribute to food security. One is by directly consuming fish, and the other one is through the livelihoods it creates. So my emphasis here today is going to be mostly about the livelihoods and how this group of women from Mazatlan and Southern Sinaloa organize themselves to claim access to fishing resources, and especially shrimp, to create a unique and very gender livelihood, and at the same time to provide for themselves and their families. So basically, this is, again, what I mentioned before. Shrimp is one of the most important natural resources in this region. Again, a lot of people, all the families that I live with in rural areas, and many of them in the urban context of Mazatlan, also eat shrimp at least once a week. A lot of the shrimp is actually, it comes from local estuaries and lagoons in the region's most important ecosystems. But also shrimp also is a livelihood for many people. It could be informal, and it could be like, for example, the photo that you're seeing here is that people processing shrimp in one of the many shrimp processing plants actually built in Mazatlan. And what they're preparing here is a really traditional dish, which is called textihuil, which has pre-Hispanic roots, and it's very, very common also in Southern Sinaloa. Okay, so women's work basically within the seafood industry in Southern Sinaloa is basically there are two different areas in which women actually work and contribute with their labor. One of them is a more formal aspect of the seafood industry, which is in the processing plants. This is mostly for export and global exports, that places like the US and Japan, and some places also in Europe. And then my concentration and the work that I've been doing for so many years had to do more with the informal economy and local seafood markets, and especially women's role as seafood traders also in urban street economies. So this photograph here actually shows one of the marketplaces in Mazatlan. I was trying to kind of contextualize my work also within the whole literature of women and fisheries in Mexico. There is not a lot of literature yet, but I think I was able to find some information, and these are some of the same things that are really, really important that they were discussed in some of these readings. For example, the work of women in seafood processing, the relationship between gender, ethnicity, and the local ecology, the migration of women seafood workers, and this is very important, especially from areas in Sinaloa, where women actually migrate to North Carolina to work in the crab processing plants as well. And then women's also work in the oyster fisheries in Mexico, especially in Campeche. And then a lot of them have to do with the labor and health conditions of women in seafood processing plants. And then my research had to do more with the women shrimp traders, their unionization, resistance, and issues of sustainability. So one of the things that I did actually for me to really reconstruct the history of women's participation in Mexican fisheries was basically to kind of interview women and talk to them about their beginnings as seafood traders. And this is how, for example, I interviewed this woman who I named Elena Osuna, and she talks about how she became a seafood trader because actually she learned that from her father, and she basically became doing that work actually as a very, very, very young age. So she was one of the women who finally settled in this seafood market here in Mazatlan, and she helped organize it as well. Okay. This is another role that women play also within the industry, mostly within the seafood industry and shrimp in particular, is that a lot of them actually begin selling shrimp on the streets of Mazatlan. They go from the rural communities to Mazatlan. They go from one colonia to the next, house by house, selling their product, basically. And this is the case of Alma Flores, who I accompanied one day as she was selling shrimp in one of the colonias in Mexico. Okay. A lot of the things that I want to say also here has to do with the women have to really struggle, and they really had to find a way of really gaining access. It wasn't very easy. They had to defeat a lot of policies, basically, at the time that say that only people associated in fishing cooperatives could, for example, sell and market shrimp. That had changed after the neoliberal policies in Mexico too. But I think women actually before that had to go through many things, and they had to really struggle. And so these are some of the ways they actually used to really combat and to really create their own niche and their own path towards their participation in the local shrimp industry. So confrontations with local authorities, a lot of the things that they did together. I remember a lot of the women telling about this one about throwing dirty and smelly water at the police when they came to confiscate the shrimp, basically, because they were not selling them in a space that wasn't approved by the local municipal authorities. So they faced a lot of persecution and marginalization as well too. Okay. A lot of the women actually engaged in commercial activity. They took over this street, which is one of the main streets, and this is where the main seafood market is now built in Mazatlan. And because they wanted to have a permanent place. This is how they created the market. So this is the new, what is the Mazatlan shrimp market has been there for almost 40 years now. It's basically an open air street market, and they have a law. I mean, they're organized into a union, so they have a lot of bylaws, basically. They have conflicts too. It's a very tourist destination because everybody who comes to Mazatlan actually had to visit. There are so many tours organized that people can come and see the women selling shrimp in this localized market as well. I want to say, which is very important to it, these women really, one of the things they did really that really helped them to stay in the street and gain legal access to their livelihood was basically because they organized collectively into a union. And the person who organized them was a woman whose name is Esther, who was working in one of the Tijuana maquiladoras. And she gained a lot of labor experience while they are also organizing. So she came back to Mazatlan, she was from the area, and she started working with the women, and then she also began organizing them with the help of students from the Autonomous University of Sinaloa. Okay. So basically, I just want to kind of finish to respect everybody's time here, so we all have an opportunity to present. I don't have a lot of conclusions here. I think what I have more questions when I started this research and when I finished this research, a lot of questions that I still need to find answers. I think one of the questions that I have, and this is something that I really would like to continue, and I think this is something that I was not able to find any information about this. I went to the main fisheries office, which is based, the Conapesca, based in Mazatlan, and I couldn't find a lot of information about how much actually do scale fisheries contribute to food security in Mexico, especially in rural areas. All my information comes from observations, from basically, surveys, but also by looking at, by living and sharing with people in those rural areas. But there are not really formal statistics or any data per se that I was able to use for kind of answering these questions. The other question that I have is basically what specific fisheries actually contribute the most to food security, which is very interesting because I think my concentration has to do more with the shrimp fisheries, which is something that people eat. It's part of the cuisine of Mazatlan. It's part of the seafood culture and landscape also in southern Sinaloa. And there are many, many, many traditional dishes that are based on shrimp and like tamales and everything else. But I think we don't have really specific information saying like which either one of these fisheries, shrimp or any other fishery really contribute specifically to food security. So I think these are areas for further studies. And I think also, maybe like collecting new data on some of these issues as well too. And the other question that I would like to address, I think that is really important to this research and future research is basically how does climate change and market demand impact small scale shrimp fisheries? Because I think what I have seen in the last years, in the last 10 years is that every year the fishing season and the shrimp season gets really smaller, like a few, it used to be like almost half a year. Now it's only a few months. And every year people are waiting for the rains to come. So there is some more shrimp. And also because there is a lot of demand locally and nationally for the shrimp that comes, especially from the lagoons and estuaries in the region, I think that's also putting a lot of pressure on the resources. So the question that I have also is whether or not this kind of livelihoods are sustainable at the end for the for the conservation of the resources, but for the long-term livelihoods of many of the rural population as well. So I think with that, I end my presentation, and thank you so much, and I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you, Maria, for the presentation.
Thank you.
I don't see any question in the box. I guess we will move to the next speaker. Our next speaker is Helouise Costa. Floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. I'm gonna present in Portuguese. I didn't prepare English, so we're gonna be in Portuguese. Let me share the screen for you. Well, my research was in Brazil. Eu estudo as experiências de mundos comuns entre um grupo de mulheres do semiárido nordestino. O Nordeste é uma região muito seca no Brasil e eu estudei um grupo de mulheres que, apesar da seca e das adversidades, elas conseguem produzir, né, nessa região muito seca e muito árida e ao longo de 25 anos. Então, meu trabalho foi, minha dissertação de mestrado foi sobre essas mulheres do semiárido nordestino. Vou apresentar um pouco, um resumo da pesquisa para vocês. Então, essas são as mulheres, né, que eu pesquisei. A minha questão principal foi por que o nome do grupo é Mulheres Decididas a Vencer? Decididas a vencer o quê? Dentro dessa região. Então, eu parti dessa pergunta e fui investigar essas mulheres. A minha questão de pesquisa foi como essas integrantes traduzem e criam seus próprios modos de viver, né? A partir da composição de atores que têm influenciado a construção desse coletivo. Então, meu objetivo é compreender a relação dessas mulheres, né, as transformações socioambientais, né, sob uma perspectiva transdisciplinar, incluindo ecologia social, psicologia social, a partir desse estudo de caso. Então, o meu objetivo, tem vários objetivos específicos, é construir com o grupo a sua história, por meio de conversas, entrevistas, documentos, levantar qual a experiência de construção de mundos comuns pelas integrantes, analisar de que modo práticas rurais estão relacionadas com grupos femininos, identificar qual é a relação dessas mulheres com o lugar e o território que fazem parte do seu cotidiano. Então, eu estudei essas mulheres, né? Aqui o meu campo foi o Rio Grande do Norte, uma região de bioma caatinga, que é um clima semiárido, 75% do estado do Rio Grande do Norte, e ocorre um processo de desmatamento nessa região. Então, meu trabalho ele tem a ver com a adaptação dessas mulheres frente às mudanças climáticas. Então, essa região muito seca, e eu estudei como ocorreu as transformações, como essas mulheres se adaptaram a essa seca e esse clima tão inóspito, né, nessa região, ao longo desse tempo, que tipo de produção elas fizeram ao longo do tempo, com quem elas puderam contar para ajudar elas em tudo isso. Então, para falar um pouquinho mais do clima semiárido, essa é o Nordeste, que é o clima semiárido no Nordeste do Brasil, onde tem chuvas irregulares, altas temperaturas de 27 graus, 32% da população rural. Could you see the slide moving now or no?
No.
No?
I think you have to kind of change yourself. If you go to the, I don't know, the prompt here.
Go to presentação.
Yeah.
Go to the slide option.
Slide option.
Yes, on the top.
Slide control.
Yeah, it has to be like in the visual. Yeah. More.
On the top of your PowerPoint, there's next to animation. Next to animation. At the top.
Here? What about now?
Next to the animation option.
Animation option.
Yeah. Next to animations, you have your slideshow option.
Animation.
Next one, next to that one.
Transitions?
Yes.
Yes.
No, next. No,
Present,
next to that, yes.
Here.
And then go to configurar. Configurar, yes. Or no. The next bullet. Go to the
Here?
configurar, and then tap the next bullet, apresentada por una.
Ah, okay.
Next one, yes.
That's it?
That should work, yes.
Okay. Could you see now? Oh, 1 second. Oh, what about
yes,
now?
it's perfect.
Perfect. All right. Sorry, everyone. Essas são as mulheres que eu estudei, né, na minha pesquisa. São as mulheres do grupo Decididas a Vencer. Então, o meu estudo foi, a minha questão de pesquisa foi por que elas estavam, por que elas são decididas a vencer, né? Vencer o quê? Então, essa foi a questão da minha pesquisa. E também de que forma elas traduzem, criam seus próprios modos de viver a partir desse jogo de composição, né? O objetivo geral, compreender a relação dessas mulheres com as transformações socioambientais. Então, reconstruir o grupo e sua história, levantar como boa experiência de construção desses mundos. Aí eu apresentei aqui a região para vocês não viram, mas aqui é o mapa do Rio Grande do Norte, é o bioma Caatinga, é a maior região, ecossistema da região Nordeste. Região Nordeste é uma região muito seca do Brasil, clima semiárido, e foi nessa região que aconteceu a minha pesquisa. Esse aqui, né, é o clima semiárido que se estende todo o Nordeste, né, e parte do Sudeste do Brasil. Tem chuvas irregulares e temperaturas médias de 27 graus. Tem 67% das famílias rurais não têm acesso à rede geral de abastecimento de água. Então, o meu trabalho foi no campo, em Mossoró, no Rio Grande do Norte, num assentamento chamado Mulunguzinho. É um assentamento rural, né, onde começou com um grupo de famílias, e esses moradores foram se apropriando dessa terra, utilizando essa terra para viver e para produzir. O nome do assentamento, por conta dessa árvore aqui, chamada Mungu do Sertão. Então, eu utilizei pesquisa exploratória, né, histórias de vida, entrevista online, pesquisa documental e de arquivo, e análise de conteúdo ao final. E aí, eu utilizei ecologia política feminista, estudei também os comuns, mulheres e práticas rurais, e lugar e território. Foi a fundamentação teórica que eu usei no meu trabalho. Dentro da ecologia política feminista, eu relacionei, né, a dimensão de gênero a questões como pobreza, justiça social, neoliberalização da natureza, políticas de degradação ambiental, onde usei alguns autores aqui relacionados. O comuns, né, eu fiz uma revisão teórica do conceito até chegar a uma perspectiva de trabalho reprodutivo de cuidados. Entre os autores eu usei Dourado, Juarez, Soares, Federici, Swampa. Mulheres e práticas rurais, compreendendo a relação entre mulheres e movimentos no campo. Lugar e território, né, diferenças entre conceitos que para contribuir para o desenvolvimento de outra realidade a partir do movimento de grupos, né, usei Escobar. E aqui é um exemplo do assentamento onde essas mulheres vivem e produzem. É uma região muito afastada do centro da cidade, né, de Mossoró. Então, aqui alguns exemplos de como é esse assentamento, o que elas plantam, o que elas cultivam. Então, foram entrevistadas 6 mulheres, 10 mulheres individualmente, 10 mulheres em grupo, idade entre 27 e 68 anos, e elas moram nesse assentamento. Foram estudadas algumas categorias nesse projeto, né, como ser mulher, como elas se veem como sendo mulher. Como era um grupo de mulheres, eu queria entender como acontecia essa relação da posição da mulher no assentamento a essa produção delas dentro do território, né? Então, como o modo como as integrantes se veem como sendo mulher, como essa construção comum se faz, transformando a relação entre elas e com o meio. rede de dependências, né? O grupo, né, nós chegamos analisamos o grupo e percebemos que ele é constituído por vários atores. Então, essas mulheres tiveram ajuda, que a gente chama de uma relação commoning, ou comum, que se construiu dentro desse assentamento com essas mulheres e com as organizações que ajudaram essas mulheres a construir essa produção, né? Fazer essa produção. Também estudei a convivência com a natureza e o território. Essas mulheres, elas entendem muito do território onde elas moram, elas entendem quando plantar, quando fazer colheita, entendem o modo como as abelhas e o mel é produzido, né, no assentamento. Então, eu estudei como elas se relacionam com o próprio meio ambiente e respeitam o tempo e com isso, elas vão se adaptando ali, né, nessa região. Eu não tenho tempo para ler tudo, mas depois eu posso complementar com alguma pergunta que vier de vocês. Então, algumas considerações finais, né? Eu descobri que a potência nesse meio rural nordestino, as mulheres estão à frente desse modelo de iniciativas agrárias, que as mulheres precisam dessa rede de apoio para entender que tipo de produção elas devem fazer diante das adversidades climáticas, desde a seca até a falta de chuva. E o feminismo, para elas, representa uma virada de chave, né? O que elas veem como feminismo? Elas se reconhecem como agricultoras e ganham voz dentro do assentamento. Então, isso fez muita diferença na iniciativa que essas mulheres tiveram na produção delas ao longo de 25 anos. O feminismo para elas é visto como ponte para ganhar voz, né, e sinônimo de motivação para pequenas transformações. Ela foi construída também a partir dos frutos de movimentos de territórios comuns, com economia solidária, e há um modo comum constituído entre mulheres, natureza e território. Então, a contribuição dessa dissertação foi além do que se apresenta como ser feminismo, né, uma relação com o território, um novo olhar sobre a auto-organização atribuída às mulheres, a pesquisa pretende colaborar com reflexões sobre perspectivas diferentes dentro da teoria crítica, e além do que é trazido por alguns autores sobre movimentos no campo, e também apresenta que algo novo pode ser construído sempre, mesmo nos lugares aparentemente sem perspectivas, como o semiárido nordestino, que é um clima muito seco. E aí, essa pesquisa ela pretende colaborar como inspiração para estudos de outros grupos que decidiram permanecer nos seus territórios e transformar a realidade socioambiental deles de maneiras diferentes. Então, é isso. Muito obrigada. Thank you.
Thank you, Helouise. We're going to go to the next speaker, Verenice Mosso Salas.
Sí, gracias. Continuación, subo mi
Yes.
Ya, sí logran observar las diapositivas, la presentación.
Sí,
Ok, muy bien, gracias.
de nada.
Bueno, me presento. Mi nombre es Verenice Mosso Salas. Estoy ahorita en un doctorado en ciencias ambientales y el proyecto que estoy realizando, en este caso, es experiencia participativa para la solución de problemas relacionados con la pesca en Barra de Tecoanapa, Guerrero, México. Como medio de introducción, es la conformación e importancia de la pesca ribereña. La pesca ribereña incluye diversidad de especies. Esta está conformada por crustáceos, moluscos y pelágicos. Y tiene una importancia porque contribuye a la seguridad alimentaria y genera empleo. En este caso, estoy abordando esta investigación enfocándola más bien en el sistema social ecológico. En este caso es en Barra de Tecoanapa. El territorio costero marino conforma lo que es el sistema social ecológico. En este caso está conformado por el sistema social, que son los pescadores, y el sistema ecológico, en este caso el ecosistema marino. A esos dos sistemas lo une la subsistencia, que es el producto, o ya sea el recurso, el producto que ellos pescan. Como ubicación geográfica del área de pesca en Barra de Tecoanapa, está en los límites de Punta Maldonado, y el municipio de Markelia, como se muestra en el mapa. Pueden observar. Ya. Los problemas que afectan la pesca ribereña, en este caso en la localidad de Barra de Tecoanapa, es la falta de organización, hay una comercialización muy controlada por el acaparador y la disminución del producto. Todo esto influye en que se está agotando el recurso. En este caso, se va más a lo que es la especie del huachinango, que es la que más se captura en esa localidad. En esta diapositiva les muestro lo que es las toneladas que se capturan por año. En este caso se encuentran las rayas y similares con un 53.8%. De ahí le sigue el huachinango con 47.4%, la lisa con 29.5 toneladas, tiburón con 21.6%, la bandera, mejor conocida como cuatete, en 21.4%, le sigue el pargo con 15.0%, cazón con 10.5%, cocinero con 9.2%, jurel con 8.1%, mero con 6.0%, robalo con 4.6%, sierra con 2.8%, corvina con 2.7%, ronco con 1.7%, de ahí le siguen 15 grupos más con un 4.3%. Como metodología, aquí les presento lo que es el mapa donde se encuentra ubicada lo que es la localidad de Barra de Tecoanapa, que se encuentra en la parte sur de lo que es la República Mexicana. De acuerdo a eso, se llevó a cabo lo que es el taller participativo, donde se trabajaron con un grupo de pescadores. El propósito de este taller fue identificar los principales problemas sociales, ecológicos y económicos de la pesca en Barra de Tecoanapa. Como segundo objetivo, jerarquizar en orden de importancia del 1 al 3 los problemas más importantes en la pesca en Barra de Tecoanapa. Como tercer objetivo, es donde los participantes del taller propongan soluciones a los 3 principales problemas que se detectaron en la actividad pesquera. Este es el proceso metodológico que se siguió para lo que es la elaboración del taller participativo. Como título tuvo Problemas y soluciones por una pesca sustentable en Barra de Tecoanapa, Guerrero, México. Como primera instancia se recolectaron datos, en este caso con el comisario municipal y pescadores en general. De ahí se convocó y se invitó al taller participativo de manera oral, y también se hicieron invitaciones por medio de perifoneo y también como que de boca a boca, ¿no? Para lo que es realizar este taller, también se citaron diferentes fuentes de literatura, como se muestra ahí, y se conformó un equipo de trabajo que estuvo conformado por 4 facilitadores, un coordinador y un fotógrafo. En este caso, el coordinador, pues aquí su servidor, ¿no? De acuerdo a ello, se tomaron acuerdos y se revisó la literatura con todo el equipo de trabajo. De ahí nos tuvimos que ir al lugar donde se iba a llevar a cabo lo que era el taller participativo. En este caso, reconocimiento del lugar, se llevó a cabo el taller. El material de apoyo, pues unas diapositivas, cañón, una computadora, libretas, plumones y una cámara fotográfica. El taller estuvo conformado por 6 momentos. El primero, presentación y objetivos del taller. En el segundo, presentación de los asistentes. El tercero, identificación de problemas. El cuarto es donde se jerarquizó en orden de importancia. El 5, integración de grupos de trabajo para proponer soluciones. Y el 6, donde se clausuró el taller. Los datos se analizaron por medio de la asistencia al taller, métodos para la búsqueda de problemas, métodos para priorizar problemas, cuáles fueron los problemas más importantes, cómo resolver los problemas y las propuestas para la solución de los problemas. En ese taller asistieron lo que fueron pescadores, adultos, jóvenes y esposas de pescadores. Estuvo también presente el comisario municipal y pues, los pescadores también, bueno, asistieron de cooperativas y pescadores libres. Y como resultados, se contó con la presencia de 68 personas, entre ellos pescadores, esposas de pescadores, y ahí estuvieron 2 presidentes de cooperativas, las cooperativas Una Nueva Milenio y Verdaderos Pescadores de Barra de Tecoanapa. En la identificación de problemas, estuvieron identificados 9 problemas, como del medio social, el seguro médico con 69 votos, falta de organización para resolver problemas con 68 votos, conflictos con pescadores aledaños, cual tuvo un voto. En el medio económico, altos costos de la gasolina con 55 votos, precios bajos del producto y costos de la captura altos con 44 votos, reparación de embarcaciones muy seguido con 18 votos, y por el medio ecológico estuvo la disminución de la abundancia del producto con 54 votos, contaminación del agua con 39 votos y las redes varadas en el fondo marino con 6 votos. Aquí en esta lámina les muestro cómo se identificaron los problemas. En la priorización de problemas, pues salieron 3 problemas más importantes para ellos, pues seguro médico con 69 votos, falta de organización para resolver problemas con 68 votos y altos costos de la gasolina con 55 votos. Propuestas de solución a los problemas encontrados. Por esto lo hicimos por 5 preguntas guías que se les facilitó a los pescadores para que pudieran buscar una solución a los problemas que ellos mismos encontraron. La pregunta número 1, ¿qué queremos hacer? Como pregunta número 2, ¿quiénes lo vamos a hacer? Como pregunta número 3, ¿cómo lo vamos a hacer? Pregunta número 4, ¿con qué lo vamos a hacer? Y pregunta número 5, ¿qué tenemos y qué nos falta? Esas fueron las posibles soluciones que los pescadores dieron a sus problemas. Como seguro médico, ellos cuestionan pagar por su cuenta el seguro médico, solo no tienen la orientación y necesitarían la orientación por medio de un experto, también organizarse y proponérselo a sus patrones o ellos mismos formar una asociación y hacer la gestión. El segundo problema, falta de organización para resolver problemas. Todos coinciden en que para llevar a cabo sus objetivos, tanto personales como a nivel comunitarios, deben de hacer el esfuerzo por organizarse y trabajar en equipo por el bien de la comunidad y la pesca. Tercer problema, altos costos de la gasolina. En este problema todos coinciden en que no depende de ellos, el costo de la gasolina. Por lo tanto, ese punto no puede modificarse, dado a que es un problema a nivel gobierno, pero sí pueden combinar la pesca con otra actividad. En este caso, algunos mencionaron promoción al turismo. Y a las conclusiones, pues es un territorio socioecológico de la pesca ribereña en Barra de Tecoanapa que se encuentra sumergida en diversos problemas ecológicos, económicos y sociales. La pesca es poco sostenible, no hay reglas a nivel comunitario que la protejan de la pesca furtiva. Se percibe una falta de organización a nivel local entre pescadores para hacer frente a los problemas en la pesca. Y ya, fue todo lo que les quería exponer. Muchas gracias. Y gracias por su atención.
Thank you, Verenice. Our next presentation will be presented by María José Marín Meneses. The virtual floor is yours.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Hola, buenas.
Ah,
Yo haré mi presentación en español y compartir. ¿Me escuchan bien?
sí,
Porque sí,
sí, te
listo.
escuchamos.
Porque estoy teniendo problemas con el internet.
Ok.
Vale. Voy a compartir la pantalla.
Yo creo que hay Mosso. Ok, necesitaba. Ok. Ujú.
Muy bien. ¿Me cuentan? ¿Ya la pueden ver?
Sí, ya la puedo ver.
Sí, ya.
Perfecto.
Sí, muy
Bueno,
bien ahora. Muy bien. Ujú.
bueno. Buenas tardes. Mi nombre es María José Marín Meneses. Yo hago mi participación desde Colombia con esta investigación que me permitió optar al título de bióloga. Esta investigación se tituló Visibilizando los roles de la mujer en la pesca artesanal marino-costera en el Golfo de Salamanca en el marco de los derechos humanos. Esta investigación fue un proyecto de cooperación entre la Universidad del Magdalena en Santa Marta y Conservación Internacional. Estuvo financiada por NORAD y se realizó desde el Grupo de Investigación en Sistemas Socioecológicos para el Bienestar Humano de la Universidad del Magdalena, dirigido por la doctora Lina Saavedra y codirigido por el biólogo Jesús Jiménez. Entonces, la pesca pues, es una actividad económica y cultural que se desarrolla en múltiples comunidades en todo el mundo. Esta pues, se puede dividir en dos subsectores, que sería como la pesca industrial y la pesca artesanal, teniendo en cuenta que la pesca industrial ocupa como grandes maquinarias y la pesca artesanal es más o se basa más en el conocimiento tradicional de los pescadores. De acuerdo con la FAO, se estima que alrededor del mundo entre el 59,51 millones de personas son dependientes de la pesca y el 14% es representado por mujeres. A nivel mundial y para Latinoamérica y el Caribe existe una limitada documentación de los aportes que realizan las mujeres dentro de este sector. Para el caso particular de Colombia, la información que se conoce o que se tiene realmente es muy limitada, exceptuando un estudio que hizo la Autoridad Nacional de Pesca y Acuicultura en el 2015, donde se registró que cerca de 20.096 pescadores están carnetizados, de los cuales el 13% son mujeres carnetizadas, el 58% son pescadoras marinas, el 42% son mujeres pescadoras continentales y el 25% se dedican de esas mujeres a extraer bivalvos y jaiba en el Pacífico colombiano. Entonces, estas mujeres realizan diferentes aportes, pero sus aportes se ven como limitados porque ellas no cuentan con un acceso a la educación, tampoco cuentan con acceso a capacitaciones, el trabajo que realizan tiene una baja remuneración en comparación con los hombres, cuentan con una poca participación en la toma de decisiones, tienen pocas oportunidades para acceder a trabajo y tienen un acceso limitado a recursos. Todas estas limitaciones se ve traducida en la vulneración de derechos a los que ellas están expuestas en el desarrollo de su labor. Sin embargo, estrategias a nivel mundial como lo son los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible, específicamente el objetivo 5, que es el de la igualdad de género, y el objetivo 14, que es el de vida submarina, buscan como reducir un poco estas brechas de desigualdad de género en el sector pesquero artesanal, así como también las directrices voluntarias para lograr la sostenibilidad de la pesca a pequeña escala, que dedica el apartado 8 a la igualdad de género dentro del sector. Entonces, a partir de esto, nos planteamos el objetivo general, que fue el de caracterizar y visibilizar los diferentes roles que cumplen las mujeres en el sector pesquero artesanal marino costero en el Golfo de Salamanca, como aporta al fortalecimiento de la equidad de género en el marco de los derechos humanos, y así los dos objetivos específicos, que el primero es el de caracterizar socioeconómicamente los roles que desempeñan las mujeres en la pesca artesanal dentro del Golfo de Salamanca, y el de identificar características que mejoren las condiciones laborales de estas mujeres en el marco de la defensa y la protección de los derechos humanos en nuestra área de estudio. Para nuestra área de estudio, nosotros lo realizamos en la parte marina, en el mar Caribe, en una zona del Caribe colombiano, que fue el Golfo de Salamanca. Trabajamos en 4 comunidades, que fue la comunidad de Pozos Colorados, Ciénaga, Tasajera y La Isla. En la parte metodológica y la manera en cómo llegamos a los resultados fue por medio de entrevistas semiestructuradas que realizamos entre enero y noviembre, que particularmente pues por la pandemia tuvimos que hacer una parte presencial y terminar el resto mediante entrevistas telefónicas. Entonces, hicimos 2 bloques de entrevistas. La primera fue el acercamiento que realizamos a las comunidades para conocer acerca de los roles a partir de los líderes y lideresas de las comunidades con las que trabajamos. Luego hicimos, de hacer ese acercamiento, ya trabajamos como tal con las mujeres. Particularmente nosotros trabajamos con mujeres asociadas y mujeres no asociadas, es decir, que realizaban su labor de manera independiente. Se realizaron 52 entrevistas, 26 a mujeres asociadas y 26 a mujeres no asociadas. Para el caso del análisis de datos, una vez finalizamos la recopilación, hicimos la transcripción de las entrevistas, procedimos a hacer la codificación y luego aplicamos estadística descriptiva y estadística inferencial usando el programa R. Con el acercamiento previo que hicimos con los líderes y lideresas de las comunidades, identificamos inicialmente 6 roles que hacían parte o que estaban dentro de las comunidades, que eran las mujeres que pelaban el camarón, las esposas de pescador, las mujeres que se dedicaban a fabricar y reparar las artes de pesca, las comercializadoras de pescado, procesadoras de pescado y mujeres que estaban dedicadas a las funciones administrativas dentro de las asociaciones de pescadores. Luego, cuando ya fuimos a la parte de campo, ya hicimos el acercamiento con las mujeres, encontramos en los resultados que de esos 6 roles que identificamos previamente en nuestras comunidades, solamente las mujeres lograron identificar o encontramos 4 roles, que fueron el rol de comercializadora, en donde se ubicaban o se situaban la gran mayoría de las mujeres entrevistadas. Luego estaban las peladoras, las pescadoras y las procesadoras. Esto, de cierto modo, pudimos hacer un contraste con diferentes autores en donde dejaban en evidencia que las mujeres participan principalmente en la comercialización del pescado. También hicimos, nuestro estudio permitió visibilizar o conocer, más bien reconocer las dificultades a las que están enfrentadas las mujeres dentro del sector. Ellas identificaron 5 dificultades. La primera fue la falta de oportunidades y reconocimiento del trabajo que ellas realizan, la falta de capacitaciones, las pocas oportunidades para acceder a créditos, la igualdad de participación en la toma de decisiones y el uso y control de los recursos. Entonces, al momento de entrevistar a nuestras participantes, ellas situaron las principales dificultades en la falta de oportunidades y el reconocimiento que ellas realizan dentro del sector, la falta que tienen de las capacitaciones, y para el caso de las mujeres asociadas y no asociadas, ambos grupos coincidían en que ellas cuentan con pocas oportunidades para acceder a créditos al momento cuando ya no tienen capital o cuando quieren expandir pues su trabajo. Y la igualdad o más bien la desigualdad que tienen al momento de tomar decisiones dentro del sector pesquero, porque ellas manifestaban que no eran tenidas en cuenta o que en muchas ocasiones era lo que el hombre pues decía. Sumado a esto, ellas planteaban dos soluciones para poder como mitigar o ayudar a solventar un poco las desigualdades a las que ellas se enfrentan. La primera solución es el acceso o tener un mayor acceso a capital, porque en ocasiones como ellas también proveen o ayudan en la economía de sus hogares, cuando las ventas no son muy buenas, ellas deben tomar como de ese capital que tienen destinado para su trabajo para solventar las necesidades de su hogar, y la otra es crear o generar un comité que sea propio de mujeres, que les permita como ir dándole visibilidad a su trabajo. Seguido de esto también encontramos que las mujeres se enfrentan a vulneración de derechos. Ellas mencionaron estos derechos que se les vulnera, pero se situaron o se logró identificar que los principales derechos a los que ellas se enfrentan se encuentran vulnerados tanto para el caso de las mujeres asociadas como de las mujeres no asociadas, es el derecho a la igualdad de género y el derecho a la participación que ellas no están teniendo dentro del sector pesquero artesanal. Y esto se puede o se da porque, como autores mencionan, no han logrado evidenciar que los hombres, como al ser el sector pesquero una actividad marcada o realizada a través del tiempo por los hombres, el hecho de que las mujeres la realicen les causa como esta vulneración de derechos. Y dentro de las conclusiones que logramos percibir en este estudio, a pesar de que fue un estudio realizado para una zona específica del Caribe colombiano, se puede evidenciar el vacío que hay en cuanto a la información para Colombia. También se puede evidenciar que las mujeres sí están participando y tienen una representación activa dentro de toda la cadena de valor para el caso del Golfo de Salamanca. También fue posible reconocer que las mujeres cuentan con un papel importante dentro de sus hogares al aportar, al hacer aportes económicos y también al momento de realizar actividades como lo son en la parte de la postcaptura del sector pesquero. Aparte, también se pudo concluir que aunque tienen y cuentan con una participación, la visibilización que tienen las mujeres debido a la falta de estadísticas limita que las mujeres tengan una participación activa dentro de la toma de decisiones y la gobernanza pesquera del sector. Y para Colombia no existen registros de información acerca de las desigualdades, tampoco se conocen las necesidades ni las problemáticas y la vulneración de los derechos a los que las mujeres se enfrentan. Con este estudio demostramos la necesidad de realizar este tipo de trabajos en otras zonas del país, así como también invitamos a que esta metodología se pueda replicar, debido a que es una metodología que cuenta con bajos costos, que se puede replicar de manera fácil y también puede mostrar y visibilizar esos roles que están escondidos o desconocidos de las mujeres dentro de este sector. Y ya, muchas gracias.
Thank you, María José. Our next speaker is Julia.
Is this showing the correct one? It's not the presenter view.
Yes, that's perfect.
Yes.
All right. Thanks very much, Nova. Thank you all. Maria, those were such beautiful slides. My name is Julia Mason, coming from Environmental Defense Fund, based in Boston, and I'm going to present some preliminary work on policy options strengthening nutrition provisioning from small-scale fisheries. As Maria Cruz-Torres was telling us, we're increasingly understanding that fish are a hugely important source of human health and nutrition, particularly for micronutrients, where many coastal and vulnerable populations have deficiencies or hidden hunger. And we're understanding that fish are a more bioavailable, potentially a more affordable and more environmentally friendly source of those nutrients than other forms of animal protein. But there's this disconnect where fisheries and food policy dialogues don't yet sufficiently acknowledge this importance. So, for example, our colleague Abby Bennett and her colleagues found that funding for fisheries and aquaculture was really under prioritized by development banks. So in this graph, we can see that the proportion of allocation for funding for fisheries and aquaculture has hovered around 5% for the last half a century. There's also a disconnect where we're not talking about food in the fisheries policy dialogues. So, and again, the last 25 years of COFI reports, it's really barely touched on food. We focused on fish as a commodity, as a natural resource, and not sufficiently acknowledged how much fish contributes to food and nutrition and human health. And so this disconnect means that we are missing an opportunity to harness seafood and fisheries and aquatic foods to meet our hunger and nutrition goals, particularly from small-scale fisheries, where, of course, as we've been talking about, fisheries constitute livelihoods, there's cultural benefits, and these fish are probably more likely to be feeding local communities. And so this can lead to outcomes where maybe commodity fishing is prioritized over subsistence fishing, or nutritious fish isn't reaching the people that most need it, or where sustainable fisheries management isn't prioritized because it's not clear that this is actually a clear lever for human health and for nutrition. And so what we're setting out to do is recognizing this importance, trying to translate fish in a country easy as a nutritional bank, and then explore what the withdrawals are being made from that bank. How are they being spent? And again, are they reaching the most vulnerable and undernourished populations? And then what would the policy levers be to be able to redirect that fish to the people who need it most, and to capture the full nutritional value of that bank, of that resource? And we particularly wanted to highlight the contribution of small-scale fishing to nutrition provisioning. And so to do all of this, we're using a bunch of new data sources and research that's been coming online in the last couple of years to try to link it together to be able to articulate this nutritional value of fish catch. So, for example, looking at a case study in Chile, looking at the most recent 5 years of landings data, we can say, okay, here's like this total amount of fish that was caught. We can look at the species contribution of what was being caught in the artisanal versus the industrial sector. And then we can use these nutritional databases that have the nutrition content of those fish. So we're mostly drawing from Christina Hicks's work, Fish Nutrients, which is available on FishBase. And they use a predictive model to be able to predict the nutrient content of almost all species of finfish. And so, for example, for jurel, a horse mackerel, a species that's commonly consumed for direct human consumption in Chile, it's considered sort of cheap fish, it's accessible, it's served canned. From Fish Nutrients, we have the nutrition facts of this fish for 100-gram serving. And here that I've expressed these in terms of the World Health Organization's daily recommended nutrient intakes for children. And so we can see jurel is a really great source of protein, of selenium, also zinc and omega-3s. And so we can take all of the different species that are available in this Fish Nutrients database and translate that species composition and catch composition into edible nutrient yield. And so here we can see that, this 800,000 tons in the artisanal sector translates to being 2.5 tons of calcium each year, or 15 tons of omega-3 fatty acids. But what does that really mean? What does 2 tons of calcium represent? So instead we can translate this, again, using those WHO, those recommended nutrient intakes, we can translate this into the amount of people whose nutrient needs would be met by that catch. So in this case, it would be about 5 million children. In this case, children could be fed per day. And of course, this would be if you fed all of the catch that was caught in Chile to children and we're feeding them enough each day to meet their 100% of their nutrient needs. So it's not necessarily a realistic number, but it sort of gives you a sense of the possibility and the nutrient potential of that catch. And so what we can see from this, just preliminary results, is that even though in this case the artisanal sector is catching a greater volume, the industrial sector over here in blue might be contributing more of most of these nutrients except for omega-3s. So maybe the species composition is catching species that are more iron rich, more vitamin A rich, more zinc rich. And so this kind of represents our overall nutrient bank. But then we can start to look into policy levers. So how are these fish being spent? One possibility is how these fish are used. So from the Sea Around Us database from the University of British Columbia, we can look at the end use that's used for these fish. Is it feeding people? Is it being converted into fish meal and fish oil? And so when we look at just fish that people eat here in blue, and again, separate that into the artisanal and industrial sector, we can really see that the artisanal sector is actually feeding people the majority of these nutrients. So that's one example. I'm zooming in here on calcium, just one of these nutrients, of a potential policy lever or a potential nutrition gap. We're losing nutrient yield to non-food uses that represents the nutrition needs for about 4 million children each year. And now that gap might not be a feasible policy lever if those fish aren't palatable or the countries lack the processing capacity to be able to market them. But there could be other levers. So for example, who else is fishing those fish? Are we losing some of this nutrient bank to foreign fishing? Of what's caught domestically, is some of it exported to other countries? Who has access to the fish that is kept domestically? Is it sold in tourism markets for high value? Is it reaching nutritionally vulnerable populations? And then a big question for all of this is what will happen with climate change, which we know is affecting species productivity and stock distribution, and so could actually change the overall size of these columns. So to answer that question, the data source that we're using are projections from partners at UC Santa Barbara, who have species-specific projections to the end of the century of what's going to happen to fish productivity and distribution in each country's economic zone under different climate change scenarios and also different management scenarios. And I have a QR code here. I'm not sure if this will work over Zoom, to an interactive web tool where you can see for each country's EEZ and each species sort of the changes projected in biomass and yield and profits for all of these species under the different management scenarios. And so we can take these projections through mid-century in different climate scenarios and kind of understand if potentially implementing climate smart management would also be a lever for improving nutrient yields. So for example, for Bacalaurillo, an important small-scale fishery species in Chile, under the business as usual, no changes in management scenario in red, this species is projected to have quite severe declines in its population or its net catch. But under adaptive management, at least through the mid-century, we could actually improve the yields. And so this gap, this distance between them is kind of our nutrient upside. And again, we can translate that amount into the nutrient yield and the number of children or the number of people whose nutritional needs would be met. So in this case, the nutritional upside of about 8,000 tons would be enough to feed 500,000 children their selenium needs, 100,000 children their calcium needs, et cetera. So this is the additional number of children that could be fed in the future by implementing this climate smart or adaptive management. And so I'm just going to share some preliminary results from our 4 case studies in Chile, Peru, Indonesia, and Sierra Leone. And this is using publicly accessible data from the Sea Around Us database. Here we're just separating the catch into the artisanal and small scale sector. And we can see that in Chile and Sierra Leone, the artisanal sector in this pink color is really the nutritional powerhouse, whereas in Indonesia and Peru, the industrial sector is providing more nutrients. And again, this is just domestic catch that it's intended for direct human consumption. Foreign fishing, which is captured and reconstructed in the Sea Around Us database, doesn't seem like it's a big nutrition expenditure for Chile and Peru or Sierra Leone, but maybe a significant lever in Indonesia, particularly for selenium. And then in terms of end uses, fish meal here in pink, there's pretty significant losses of nutrient yield in Chile and Peru to fish meal, around the order of 5 million children, 3 million children, maybe more like 30 million children's nutrition needs lost to fish meal uses. Discards are also potentially a lever in Indonesia. And then finally, implementing this climate adaptive management looks like, I'm looking at the y-axis here, the difference in these numbers could be a really significant gain for Peru and Indonesia in terms of its improved nutrient yield. Whereas for Sierra Leone, which is a tropical nation that's going to be hit really hard by species moving poleward, this is much less of a potential strategy despite implementing adaptive management. And so other policy levers might be needed to improve nutrient yield. The next steps where we're going with these case studies is that we're taking key species that are, especially key species caught in small scale fisheries, and kind of zooming in on them to understand how they're being used and utilized and where those nutrients are going. We're going to be bringing in export data, working with our partners, Jessica Gebhardt from American University, who is putting online a publicly available database of commodity trade. Really looking into distribution and consumption, who's eating this fish. And for this, we're relying on supply chain reports or any kind of local data that we can get our hands on. We're also working with a partner at Michigan State University to incorporate an inland case study in Malawi, which has a fully different set of data sources and data availability, but some similar challenges for nutrient provisioning. And then really evaluating for all of these different countries, they have really different contexts, really different availability and confidence that we have in the data. So we want to be able to tailor this nutrition investigation to be able to say, given the amount of data that you have and the data sources, these are the questions that you can answer, and these are the different policy levers that you might be able to pursue. So I want to thank our collaborators and the data providers. I have, again, these QR codes to all of these data sources and interactive tools here. I hope you're able to check those out. I can also send some of those links if anyone's interested. And please feel free to be in touch with me at my email address here.
Thank you very much, Julia, for your presentation. So now we'll move to the next speaker, Dana Grieco. The virtual floor is yours.
All right, can you see my screen all right? I know it has this search bar in it, but I think that's gonna have to stay, unfortunately. But thank you so much for the opportunity to present. It's fun to be kind of rounding out these talks. They've all been great to listen to. And so I'm going to talk this evening just a little bit about a project that we've been working on at Duke University for the past few years that involves partners at WWF, and it's also funded by our Duke Bass Connections program, and it's looking at impacts of tropical conservation on marine fisheries. And so,
sorry,
yeah,
but the slides are a bit cut off. We are only seeing. We're only seeing the half, maybe.
Oh, okay. Sorry, let's see. Okay, can you see the whole thing now?
I think so. Now we're seeing. I'm seeing the whole picture.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. This is
Thanks.
the trouble of presenting on a laptop sometimes. Okay. All right. There we go. Okay. All right. So when we're talking about marine policy and evidence here, tropical marine ecosystems are currently facing impacts from human activities that a lot of us may know about, such as pollution, habitat damage, overexploitation, and climate change. And those in developing countries, which are heavily congregated in the tropics, depend on marine resources and are bearing a large brunt of these impacts. And so tropical coastal marine ecosystems are areas rich in biodiversity, which provide many ecosystem services, yet they face increasing threats previously described. And so there's been a recent push to increase conservation and sustainable use of tropical marine coastal ecosystems. And this has led to rapid increase in the number and the diversity of conservation interventions around the world. However, evidence regarding the social and the ecological outcomes of these interventions is often disaggregated and lacking. And so our research team applied a systematic mapping approach to describe the distribution of the literature on ecological and social outcomes associated with conservation interventions in tropical coral reef, seagrass, and mangrove habitats. And so I want to define a few key terms for you here using an intervention and outcome framework that our team developed. So conservation interventions are how coastal marine conservation has been adopted and implemented. For example, market-based schemes, marine protected areas, restoration, and capacity development. And we define outcomes as impacts on human well-being, attitudes, behavior, or knowledge, so kind of social outcomes, or individual animals, populations, species, ecological communities, or habitats, so the ecological outcomes. And when we're using evidence synthesis, we define evidence synthesis as the process of bringing together information from a range of sources and disciplines to inform debates and decisions on specific issues. And so this process supports evidence-based decision-making. And evidence synthesis targets ways to understand the existing evidence base and best ways to most effectively communicate that evidence to different user groups. And it can take a range of forms from meta-analyses to narrative reviews, conceptual models, etc. And for this work, we chose to use systematic maps for our approach. So systematic mapping is an approach where you create a graphic to display the distribution of the literature in your interested topic. So this systematic map uses stringent methods with a standard peer review protocol beforehand, and it's used to assess the literature and report it so that it's transparent and repeatable. Looking at this example from McKinnon et al., we can see the areas where there's a large number of studies in a particular focus, and those are represented with darker color gradients, right? And this map also shows us gaps in the literature, which are the lighter colors. And we also have numbers here to kind of help show just how many studies there are. And so with this map, we can get a quick view of where the focus is in terms of active research. And we published our peer-reviewed protocol, including our search string and intervention and outcome frameworks in 2020. And after that, we've begun diving into the literature. So our search string itself yielded over 100,000 papers, which is not typically feasible for a search team. And so we took a 10% random sample from that is representative of the literature and was attainable for our research team. And with that, we completed title abstract screenings, and then after full text screening, and ended up with 231 accepted full text papers. And so I want to show you our preliminary results from this work, because that's kind of the most interesting piece here in terms of conservation. So this heat map is of the study countries designated by where conservation was taking place. And so this tropical research is the highest in the US and Australia. And we see big gaps in Africa, Central South America, and the Caribbean. And so zooming in here, because this conference is about Latin America and the Caribbean, I just want to let you be able to get a closer look. And these gaps are really important because we know that people in a lot of these tropical countries, again, are very heavily dependent on marine resources, yet research isn't really heavily congregated here in terms of conservation. And this slide shows our systematic heat map itself for our coral reef, seagrass, and mangrove habitats. The frequency of cases represented, like the number of articles is shown kind of by the darkness of the blue color, and interventions are in columns and conservation outcomes are in rows. So I'll kind of describe this more. So for example, let me just slide this over. There we go. We see that there's a glut of literature in this cell. So really a lot of literature congregated in this cell. And that means that there's a lot of literature surrounding how the intervention of species management, so what we describe as actions directly managing or restoring specific species. So for example, harvest management or species reintroduction leads to ecological population species outcomes. And population species outcomes are outcomes that focus on a change in populations or individuals within species. So for example, fish abundance or recruitment or population connectivity. So we're seeing a lot of literature there. And this cell refers to the literature related to the same species management, conservation intervention, but it's actually looking at how it leads to social human well-being outcomes, which we classify as outcomes related to changes in welfare of populations that rely on areas where interventions are implemented. So this can include things like resource-based livelihoods, food security, which we've talked about in this session, and culture. We also notice many gaps in the conservation literature, especially as related to certain conservation interventions, such as awareness raising, enforcement and protection, and also education and training. And so when we split up this heat map by habitat, we actually see the same patterns in all three habitats that we see in the overall heat map. And we note that coral reefs have the highest literature base, which isn't surprising because research on coral reefs started happening decently before seagrasses and mangroves. And this tree map of outcome categories and subcategories just shows kind of a visual representation of outcome distribution in the literature. So here you can see that population species outcomes and ecological community outcomes both have a lot of literature, and social outcomes like knowledge and behavior, human well-being, and governance see a lot less. And we know that conservation interventions lead to both social and ecological outcomes. And so my research has specifically focused on the questions of how they are linked through the literature and how these insights might help us understand the impacts of conservation on tropical marine fisheries themselves. So when looking into this, I found that only 16% of our accepted studies reported interdisciplinary outcomes, meaning they reported both social and ecological outcomes. And this is crucial because we know that small-scale fisheries are tightly linked social and ecological systems, right? So we need research that's looking at both of those things at the same time to really kind of get the big picture understanding of what's going on there. So when we're looking at the classic heat map that you already saw on the left versus these interdisciplinary outcomes on the right, we see that papers with interdisciplinary outcomes are more distributed in regards to many different conservation interventions and outcomes. And I just want to give you a few examples of these interdisciplinary outcome studies to see the mechanisms we were expecting and seeing in the literature. So since interventions are typically about managing people and how they interact with and use tropical marine resources, we would expect that interventions alter how users interact with the resource, which then leads downstream to ecological outcomes. And so we did find these pathways as described by authors in the literature. We found examples of how species management interventions led to knowledge and behavior outcomes, so outcomes that are typically related to awareness or responses to new practices or technologies for stakeholders. And those had downstream impacts on population species outcomes. We also saw examples of enforcement and protection interventions, so actions monitoring, enforcement, and compliance with existing laws and policies, leading to those same knowledge and behavior outcomes and downstream population species ecological outcomes. We also saw examples in the literature where authors described a conservation intervention leading first to an ecological outcome and then downstream to a social outcome. So for example, these same species management interventions were also shown to lead to both population species and ecological community outcomes. So trophic structure, species interactions, habitat quality, things like that are ecological community outcomes. And both of these downstream were connected to human well-being. Another example from the literature was that land and water management interventions, so actions directly managing or restoring sites, the wider environment, etc., led to ecosystem function outcomes, which is changes in ecosystem processes and conditions. So for example, herbivory, biogeochemistry, and this ecosystem function outcome then was connected to a downstream ecosystem service outcome where people benefit from ecosystems. Lastly, we also saw some studies that reported no connection between interdisciplinary outcomes. They just reported all of them as happening downstream of conservation interventions. So what I'm doing now is I'm bringing all of these linkages together to create conceptual interdisciplinary linkage models based on the literature itself. And this will hopefully give us an idea of what's actually being studied in these systems. And these conceptual models will look like this, but on a larger scale. And hopefully they'll aid practitioners in their conservation questions to find pathways through which they can understand what the literature says about their desired conservation interventions or outcomes. So for example, if a practitioner wants to know which pathways may lead to population species outcomes, they can easily search the pathways we found in the literature and see kind of that knowledge and behavior might downstream be a player in that. I'm also looking into key trends in the literature, for example, these kind of groupings between knowledge and behavior and population species that have come up so far. And with that, thank you for listening, and I hope there's enough time for questions for everyone.
Thank you so much, Dana, for your presentation. Does anyone have a question? We still have 4 minutes left.
Well, everyone presented already?
Yes,
Okay.
everyone did.
Okay. Well, I don't have a question, but I think what I would like to do is like we have a lot of commonality. Which I mean, listening to everybody's work, I think we have some common themes in here. And I think maybe we should talk a little bit about those common themes. One of them is in methodologies. We're using, many of us are doing qualitative, but also combining qualitative and quantitative research. And I think this is really has a lot of value in the kind of work that we do. Especially trying to, to come up with better explanations about the relationship between social and ecological systems. So maybe if anybody will, maybe talk a little bit about it. How do you think this particular methodology really helps you to address your studies? I
guess I know I just talked a lot, but I'm in a talking mood now. But I think I've been surprised at how many studies don't connect the two and how disciplinary research is often. Like even now we have a lot of great kind of public health approaches to research into nutrition, and a lot of studies are looking at that space. And then we have a lot of studies looking at the well-being and the economic space for social. And then we have a lot of studies just looking at fish ecology, for example. And so I think that that's been something, especially in the small scale fisheries space, that I feel like is really lacking, or there's a lot of global analyses, but there aren't, finite place-based analyses that bring everything together. Yeah. So
thank you.
Okay, I think we don't have much time left.
Oh, okay.
Unfortunately, we don't have time for more discussion.
Okay.
But I want to say thanks to everyone for your participation and for excellent session. We're gonna end here.
Thank you so
And-
much, Nova. I just want to say thank you for sharing the session and keeping us on track.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate
Welcome.
it.
Great job, Nova.
And it was nice meeting
Thank you.
everyone and very excellent work. I hope we can meet some other time and have more time to talk about our research.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Great work,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Great
Okay,
presentation.
take care.
Obrigada.